Hello and good evening, and very much welcome to you all, and thank you very much for coming to our Christmas discussion dinner for the Steeple Times. We were meant to have a lady called Karen Phillips. Sadly, she is unavailable due to commitments in the countryside. So instead, my old friend Claire Rubinstein, an ex-BBC publicist, who helped me launch the Steeple Times back in 2012, if you recall, at Blake's Hotel, when we had rather a spectacular party, which Angelo filmed with a crew from Sky News back then, is here again to help. This time, it's going to be a reversal of roles, and Claire is going to be interviewing me about three cases that are very much of the moment and will become even more of the moment in 2025. Menendez, the Menendez brothers, Madeleine McCann, and Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine?
Three M's.
The three M's, and I'm the fourth M, yeah. Matthew. So there we go. So welcome, Claire, and thank you very much for agreeing to stand in and help us out.
Okay, so we're going to start with the Menendez.
We're going to start with the Menendez case, which I think is the most important case of true crime at the moment. So I don't know how much the audience here know about Menendez, but
little roundup.
Well, basically in 1989, Lyle and Eric Menendez, the sons of a very wealthy couple who immigrated into America, lived in Beverly Hills, and they shot their parents, but their parents had abused them. It is a case of, I believe, their parents took their childhood, the system took their adulthood. This is a story that has long gone on as one where the victim was wrongly treated. The victims were those two boys. Those two boys have been locked up for 34 years when they were abused by both mother and father. On the final night when they killed their parents, they came to realize that their own mother had the attitude she would rather they were abused than she was abused. And then they realized their time was up and they panicked. And I've said to the people around them, they should never have killed their parents. But if you were put in a position where your parents threatened to kill you if you left, what do you do? And with parents like those, you couldn't have worse enemies.
Yep, exactly. So I was going to just start with an opening question. If I remember Matthew following this case long before the Netflix drama, which most people, at least in this country, will be familiar with it from this year. But firstly, what got you interested in this case and why?
Well, the Menendez case, I happened to meet people connected to the family in California. And
how long ago?
This would have been back in the early 2000s. And at this particular juncture, I was introduced to a journalist called Robert Rand. Robert Rand has been on this case since the beginning. He and Dominic Dunn, who was the more famous of the two. Dominic was Vanity Fair, and Dominic, tragically, his daughter was murdered by her partner, a chef, and Dominic Dunn became famous for being the true crime Vanity Fair correspondent. Robert Rand took a different view in the Menendez case, and that was that the Menendez brothers were people who had been abused. Dominic Dunn just said because his daughter had been murdered, these boys should fry. And
so without actually getting into the background of it, he just looked at
He looked at it and he associated these people as being as bad as the killer of his...
So he wasn't able perhaps to emotionally detach himself?
I think Dominic Dunn was too emotional about any kind of situation like this. Wealthy people killing wealthy people, because he came from the same background, wealthy. And the Menendez brothers grew up in a house that had been rented by Elton John the privilege there. Their father employed O.J. Simpson, ironically. He worked for them. They ended up in the same prison block as O.J. Simpson. And at the time, the prosecutors, it was one of the first televised trials. And the interesting point was the prosecutor had failed with O.J. Simpson. They'd failed with the Rodney King riots. They'd failed with many other things. And they thought, two posh white boys living in Beverly Hills, let's throw the book at them. The first trial collapsed, and I know a juror from the first trial, Hazel Thornton, a very nice lady who's written many books. She's campaigned for them to be resentenced for many years. I've been involved in their case for over 10 years. And finally, because of a very interesting development, coronavirus came along. People were bored at home. Young people were watching things on TikTok. They saw this about these two young men who'd been abused. They thought this was injustice. They started sharing videos. The TikTok generation transformed the case of Menendez. These people shared it over 25 million times. People started to say, if they were two young women, they wouldn't have been treated like this. They would not have been locked up in the same way. And it is completely wrong that they were locked up. I believe they should have been convicted of manslaughter, not murder. Robert Rand has campaigned for many, many years, and Robert Rand dealt with many of the family members, including Kitty Menendez, the mother's sister, and there was a cousin who gave evidence, but he tragically died. Robert Menendez found one of his letters that had been written before the shootings in which Lyle Menendez expressed his truth, which was his father was abusing him. And Robert Rand's letter is one of the key things that's changed this case. But earlier this year, there was a new documentary called Menendez and Menendez, The Boys Betrayed. Jose Menendez he managed bands amongst other things, and this Menendez individual, he had claimed to be abused too. None of this evidence was put to the juries. These people were abused, but this man was also abusing other people. And now it is time for them to be resentenced. And finally, the governor of California, who I have known since he was mayor of San Francisco, Gavin Newsom, it will be put before him, and hopefully in 2025, they will be resentenced. And because they've served 34 years in prison, they should be released immediately.
So just a couple of things here that we've touched on already. I was going to wonder, would the case have garnered the same interest it has had they been two boys from a underprivileged background, not living in a home Elton John had lived in, things like that?
Well, this is exactly the same as another case we'll come to, Madeleine McCann and Ghislaine Maxwell. People who come from positions of power and privilege are treated entirely differently to people who come from a council estate. And
yet they still ended up with murder rather than manslaughter.
Yes.
So it actually didn't go fully, didn't go their way in that respect.
Well, they were portrayed to the court as people who had got out and spent money after killing their parents. They bought restaurants, they bought Porsches, they bought Rolexes.
How would you explain that? Because having watched the documentary, did sit very oddly. That was
But if you watch the Netflix program, they are portrayed as monsters who go around abusing everybody they could possibly abuse in their sights, taking advantage of anything they could.
Was that a fair portrayal?
Well, I think, if you grew up in a warped family, do you know right from wrong? And we'll come to that with Ghislaine. Ghislaine Maxwell was abused, I know, by her father. I know many people who, including a psychiatrist who dealt with her, who witnessed her being abused aged 9 by her own father. She was given the option to choose. Would she like the shoe? Would she like the birch? Would she like the book? Would she like this or that? She said, I enjoy this. So when it came to her behavior to her victims, she didn't know right from wrong. These two boys, they robbed other people's houses. What they didn't have a
So
moral
they had no
compass.
value system when it came to, just
But
material wealth.
their father had the attitude, I can take what I want from anybody.
Right.
I came to America to get rich, and you're going to get famous by playing tennis. And he would beat them and abuse them if they didn't win. They had a very different moral system to somebody who grows up in a grounded, ordinary family where of course, every family has its own secrets, but this family had more secrets than you could possibly imagine. And with them, money and power was control. And those boys were told, if you leave, we kill you. They were taken on a boat, fishing, and the parents had just bought a load of guns. That is why they went out and bought guns to protect themselves.
Yeah. And so moving into 2025, you touched on that briefly with Gavin Newsom. What can we expect? What do you think?
Well, there are a number of options with the Menendez brothers. The DA has recommended giving them the possibility of parole, which means they would serve 50 years to life imprisonment with a possibility of parole. At the moment, they have no possibility of parole. It is time they were given the possibility of parole. They have served 34 years. In a normal situation, with parole, you would serve 25 years, so they would be released immediately. The judge could disagree. He could keep them there for life. That is a possibility.
And are they still in separate prisons?
They were, as part of a campaign I was involved in for the last 10 years, Gavin Newsom put them in the same prison. These boys had been separated. Yeah. After 22 years apart, they were finally put in the same prison. And, they were allowed they weren't even allowed to correspond via letter for many years. I think the American justice system is very, very cruel and heartless. They have they have their aunt and uncle. All their family were prepared to give evidence. The courts would not listen. They were kept out of it. So the next option could be the sentence could be reduced to manslaughter. I don't believe that will happen. It would be good if it did, because I believe that's what they should be convicted of. Yeah. And then Gavin Newsom could intervene and he could release. He has the power to do that, but I don't believe he'll do that because politically it wouldn't serve his interests. So that, I think, is enough of the Menendez case for the moment. Yeah. So we shall move on to Madeleine McCann, who Claire and I have a very interesting story about Madeleine McCann. I'll let you tell about our connection via the Ralph Lauren store.
Well, I think one of the first times I met Matthew was at a fundraiser, it was a charity auction, wasn't it, at the Ralph Lauren store, which is literally just across the road. And I think I turned up a little bit late, surprisingly for me. But anyway,
yes, Claire tends to be late, so fashionably late.
But so I missed this, but I knew that Mr. and Mrs. McCann were there.
The Doctors
and this
McCann,
must have
yes.
been probably a year or so after she'd gone missing. It was still very new news. So
the McCanns were very involved in a charity called PACT, Parents and Abducted Children Together, run by a former ambassador to Washington's wife. The charity has since been closed down, with good reason in my view. But this charity was exposed by the Daily Telegraph for paying the director of the charity 90% of the income of the charity, and it was very involved with the spokesman for the McCanns. So we did get to meet the McCanns there, and I met them subsequently elsewhere. This is a case to me.
But you were interested in it before that.
Yes.
Yes. So tell us how you got interested.
I became interested in the case because I met other people whose children had been abducted, and they all said to me, we don't get the help that this couple are getting. So I met a family who the parents were chauffeurs in Kensington to an ambassador, and the young boy called Martin Allen disappeared. He vanished on the underground, coming home from school, and before she died, the mother went on Radio 4 on the Sunday program, and she said, I feel sympathy for the doctors, the McCanns. They their daughter, it's terrible what's happened to her. But we never got any help because we don't have the connections they have. Without connections, you get no help in this country. The McCann case to me is an outrage because they are parents who, if they'd been ordinary people in England, they would have been charged with child neglect for leaving their children in an open apartment with the doors wide open. They didn't pay. They paid for childcare during the day. They didn't pay at night. But equally, these McCanns, they were able to meet people because of their connections. So it was at the end of the Tony Blair premiership. It was just about to be the start of Gordon Brown. It was a transition. Within 24 hours, Peter Mandelson is flown out to meet these people. Rebecca Brooks, who I know her husband very well. I have no personal problem with Rebecca Brooks. I know lots of people do. But this case was seized upon in the same way as Jamie Bolger. Every generation, a newspaper has to choose a new story to make the feel bad story that they can focus on. So Jamie Bolger, then it was Madeleine McCann, and then later comes other cases. But this case, nobody could believe that these parents could have done anything, and I'm not suggesting they did. These parents are only guilty of one thing, in my view, and that is being very naive and leaving their door open and not paying for childcare. There is nothing else that can be proven about it. But this story has generated £14 million of wasted public money on a case that will never be solved, because with all this money floating around, somebody would trade somebody in. Christian Bruckner became the patsy of this story. This man, during the 2020 coronavirus lockdowns, it's rather suited Boris Johnson when he was sick of having bad news stories every day. Oh, we've arrested a man a suspect of abducting Madeleine McCann. 4 years has passed. I've done many programs with Martin Brunt, Sky News, many other people. People who have got far greater knowledge of the case than I have. But not one shred of evidence has been produced that gives any evidence that Madeleine McCann has anything to do with Christian Bruckner, a man who has just been cleared of 5 cases of attempted rape, of all sorts of things, horrific crimes. He is a monster, an evil man, but his crimes were against 17-year-olds and 80-year-old women, primarily. His victim was not going to most likely be the 3-year-old Madeleine McCann, in my view. That is where I stand on that case.
Okay, so how do you think Kate and Jerry McCann have managed to keep this case live for so long?
Well, Kate and Jerry McCann...
many others that,
yes,
they'll, intermittent little bursts of
Kate and Jerry McCann, I cannot blame Kate and Jerry McCann for keeping their case going.
Of course.
Because if you're the parents of a child who has disappeared, vanished, you will want to keep the story live.
So do you think there's only room in the British media for one such case? Do you think it's something like that?
I think the public like to seize upon a certain story, and the media like to manipulate it into focusing on that. I know a mother of a 15-year-old. She works for the Missing People charity. Her son vanished. She says, nobody cares about my son because he was a 15-year-old boy. He maybe ran away. It just doesn't matter. And they all feel the same. Every one of these parents I speak to, they say, why don't we get this money? Kerry Needham, her child vanished in Corfu.
Yeah.
She said, I'm an ordinary woman. They get £15 million. I get nothing.
Although I did think she did very well at eventually managing to bring her case to the
She's
media.
Tried, but it hasn't solved. But nothing solves these problems. Thousands of children go missing every year.
So, just coming back to what you touched on, with the amount of the reward amounts that have been, put out in the press. Surely, why hasn't someone come forward to betray someone they're hiding? How come?
Because I don't
Why?
think there is any possibility of anyone being betrayed.
Do you think it was an accident? What do you, or
I
you
think
don't want to be drawn on it? What?
I do not accuse anybody of anything, but I think sadly for that poor child died in that apartment. The evidence would suggest the cat of our dogs sent Steph in the cupboard, the cat of our dogs sent Steph in the hire car. How the child died, we will never know. I don't believe that child is alive or will be found. Recently there was a Polish girl who claimed she was Madeleine McCann. They proved she was 100% Polish. There are people who invent that people want to be somebody they're not. She didn't want to be with the family that she didn't like, so she claimed she was Madeleine McCann.
Wow. Yep.
It was a scam. It was a complete fraud.
Course.
And an American psychic encouraged her in this regard.
So obviously it's got this worldwide following. Do you think there would ever be a Netflix or some such
program
drama made, or or is that just too close to home? Why, would that ever happen in the near future, or would we have to wait considerable time?
Well, I think
how protected from the British media?
I think with the current interest in true crime cases, even the case of Jane Andrews, the lady who murdered her fiance, who was the Duchess of York's dresser, that's being turned into a Netflix program shortly. People are so interested in all of these cases. I was at a crime conference speaking about the staircase murders, which was a case in America where a famous writer was murdered by her husband, he basically admitted to murder but not murder.
Okay.
And that was made into a story. In Ireland, cases like Sophie de Plantier, who was murdered by a mad local. Everything is now worthy of making into a TV show. So any of these programs could be this. And Madeleine McCann dramatized will be something that will occur, yes.
Okay.
Look at the Menendez. But the sad thing in all these cases, with, say, the Jeffrey Dahmer program, was nobody remembers the victims. It's always about the killer or the abductor. And in this case, there's no real resolution. But look at this John Benet case, and that is now the latest Netflix. So, yes, I think a Netflix adaptation of Madeleine McCann is on the way, as there will be a Netflix, I believe, of Ghislaine. The Ghislaine will be made into a Netflix. I've been approached about programs about Ghislaine. I was one of the last people to see Ghislaine Maxwell.
Before we get on to Ghislaine, I was just going to ask you, what can we expect? Anything for the new year coming up, 2025? Any new developments in the McCann case?
I think that Christian Bruckner will be getting out of jail for his other crimes because he's served his time. I think the Operation Grange have a lot of questions to answer. They should not. They've just been given another 300,000. Now, Martin Brunt always says to me 300,000 is not much money. Martin Brunt is Sky News' crime correspondent. He is a brilliant journalist, and he has been involved in that case since day one. But 300,000 to the public in the times of austerity is still a lot of money, and that money could be spent finding somebody who could be found. I hope they close down Operation Grange.
Okay.
But I think the other thing with Madeleine McCann, it's time to say, will she actually ever be found? I think the likelihood is never. So let's reallocate the resources.
Rational. Okay. I think is there anything else you want to add on that?
That is all for that, yes.
All right. And then moving on to, of course,
Ghislaine.
Maxwell.
Well, Ghislaine is my biggest case of all, I would say.
Tell me what got you interested, because again, I know you've been following that for a long time. You've had a few personal...
I encountered the wrath of Robert Maxwell when I was a child, a horrible, vile, evil man. A man who stole from pensioners, a disgusting creep who was abusive and horrible to his staff. I know the psychiatrist or the family. elements of the family. I have encountered many people who've worked with him, some famous, Anne Robinson, for example. She was one of the few people who stood up to Robert Maxwell. She walked into his office and she said, I want to be paid more, when she worked for him at the Mirror. And he said, no, I'm not going to pay you more. And she said, well, I'm leaving. And he said, nobody talks to me like this. She walks out of there with a pay rise and a brand new BMW. She was one of the courageous people who stood up to this horrible man who would relieve himself off the top of his office in Fleet Street onto the public because he so despised them. He would eat with his hands out of tins of caviar. He would throw towels on the floor. He wouldn't use lavatory roll. He was disgusting. He was an absolute pig, and he shouted at me when I was a child, and I thought, I don't like you. Anyway, in 2019, I happened to be at a party for victims of sex trafficking, a car rally from London to Monaco for women, and there were lots of very famous women, Paris Hilton and Chloe Green, the daughter of Philip Green, who also connects to the McCanns. He was a big funder of theirs. And everyone was interested in them. And there was Ghislaine Maxwell, who was driving a car with Nettie Mason, who was the wife of the Pink Floyd drummer, Nick Mason. And nobody was really interested in Ghislaine, but there was Ghislaine at a party for victims of sex trafficking. And it was in Bibendum restaurant, just around the corner, just next to the Ralph Lauren. Everything happens in this little triangle here, in this whole set of stories. So Ghislaine then, within 2 weeks, had vanished. The world wanted to look for her. She was spotted in Los Angeles at the In-N-Out, the In-N-Out burger, but she forged the photograph. The photograph was forged by a publicist because it had a poster for a film that had never been advertised at that particular bus stop in the background. So she was showing her deception. And of course, Ghislaine turned up at a house called Tucked Away. This is a woman who's gone into hiding and she moves to a house called Tucked Away. Isn't that crazy?
Yes, she likes the irony, right?
I think Ghislaine is a prime example of sheer arrogance. Just before you arrived, I sat downstairs and I met a man whose brother was wanted to marry Ghislaine.
Oh
and
goodness.
He worked at Bear Stearns, and he told me how wonderful Ghislaine was. Ghislaine is smoke and mirrors. Ghislaine knows how to turn on the charm. Ghislaine, equally, knows how to manipulate. She is the product of her father. Her father once said...
Well, I was going to say, there's either that, or is she an abused child who went on to abuse? What's it going to... Or...
Yes, so Ghislaine was abused aged 9 by her own father. My friend Kirby Summers wrote a book about Ghislaine Maxwell, which I helped her with. In that book, it begins with the quotation, "I have a beautiful daughter, and she's just like me." That is why he named the yacht after her. He didn't name it after his other daughters.
Yeah.
He was obsessed with this girl because he molded her into being the monster that he was. I believe, and my book is about this, it's called Ghislaine Maxwell, Follow the Money. It will be coming out maybe next year. Everyone wants me to get on with it, but I keep putting it off because I keep finding new leads. And Ghislaine, I believe, used Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein, and the man downstairs earlier, he said, I was in the Epstein address book. I said, it is not the Epstein address book. Every single person I know in that address book knew Ghislaine. They all said, we'd never met this man. He was mythical. He was a taxi driver who became a teacher at a very smart girls' school, Dalston, in New York, Dalton, and he taught the children of very rich people.
And how did they meet
So the
them?
hedge fund people realized this mathematician was so clever, they gave him a job at Bear Stearns. Robert Maxwell, I have been able to prove, met Jeffrey Epstein before Ghislaine. Ghislaine claims through connections in the world of finance and through records of travel. And what happened next is Robert Maxwell falls off the back of the boat. Now, my friend John Sweeney, who's Newsnight, we've debated this many times. He believes he was murdered by, Mossad and all of this. I think he wanted to kill himself because he knew his time was up. He had marks on his arms here and there. He tried to get back on the boat. People who commit suicide often experience regret as they do it. He was so fat and so disgusting. The boat was moving. No way he could get back on board. There was no one to help him. He floated away into the sea. He died. He wanted to die because he didn't want to face the music. The next week he would have been up before the regulators. It would have been a total disgrace. His name would have been, he'd reached the end of his chapter.
Okay.
People like that, megalomaniacs, they all come to an end. Bernie Madoff. It was all very well until the final money couldn't keep coming in. So it's a case with Ghislaine. What happened next is Ghislaine says, I've got no money. They've taken my teaspoons. She lost her home. Ghislaine moves to New York. She's got no money. Within 6 months, Ghislaine Maxwell lives in a $10 million house. Within a year, there is a memorial lunch in New York for Robert Maxwell. The top table, I got the photograph. The top table pictured between Betty Maxwell, the widow, and Ghislaine is Jeffrey Epstein. Now, if you're not an important person to this person and you've only just met them, you would not be at the top table at the memorial lunch. This man was the money funnel for the £500 million. Ghislaine was the controller of the money. This was all put through a trust called La Hogue in Jersey that went to Panama, and these people were all involved in a big Ponzi scheme, and these pensioners are the real victims here. And Ghislaine does not deserve sympathy in that regard, but I do view Ghislaine to be a victim of her own father. She is a monster of her father's creation, okay. And that is a very sad thing. But that does not excuse why she needed to go out and abuse other people.
Okay, and what do you think she saw in Epstein?
In Epstein, she just saw a useful person to keep her in the lifestyle she was accustomed to. And with him, he realized that he could use these girls to manipulate other people. And with the new president coming, the new president has a great friend, Elon Musk, and Elon Musk wants the lists released. These lists include a lot of very famous people, and these people will be named and shamed. And I think the most tragic thing for Ghislaine is, one woman has been blamed for sex trafficking all these people. Who did she sex traffic them to? You can't have a victimless crime where if you're not supplying them to somebody. So I do think that Ghislaine, it is not fair that she has been targeted in that way.
Well, I was also going to say there's so many of these high-profile cases of people who have abused their power and, become sexual predators. Surely they wouldn't actually, go out and hunt for women themselves. There has to be another Ghislaine in many of these other cases.
Well,
do you think that's possible?
Ghislaine recruited people like Virginia. I've spoken to 4 out of 5 of Ghislaine's victims. I believe three of the 4 I know. I don't know the 5th one. I believe that most of them are very convincing people. They were manipulated. They were taken advantage of. But some of the people, like Virginia, she brought in other people because she didn't want it to happen to her. The cycle moves on. My friend Dr. Soham Das, who was a Broadmoor psychiatrist, I asked him, how many people who are victims of abuse become an abuser? I thought it would be 60%. He said no, 92, 95%.
Okay. So, and then moving forward, do you think she's going to publish her own account of what happened? I mean, she still owes her lawyers, I think.
I've been corresponding with a lady connected with the case, Christina Oxenberg. Christina Oxenberg is someone who's known Ghislaine a long time. She tells me Ghislaine will be publishing a book in 2025. Ghislaine believes she'll get out of prison. She just failed in her latest appeal attempt. She hasn't paid her lawyers. As far as I'm aware, she owes them at least £3 million. If I were a lawyer, why would you take on her case? A woman who does not pay, would you really want her unless you want the notoriety? With the Menendez brothers, Mark Garagos has taken on their case. The Kardashians have got involved. But Ghislaine is not a person you'd want to get involved with in the same way as who wants to get involved with the P. Diddy case, for example, right now.
Yes, exactly.
It's the same thing, but a different...
Do you think P. Diddy would have had a Ghislaine working for him?
Oh,
Going
without
out,
a doubt.
Scoping out?
Without a doubt. And, this weekend it's only been...
There's obviously going to be a network in all these things.
It's just been revealed this weekend that, Mohammed Fayed had a Ghislaine of London, which he was referred to.
So it's a whole interesting role, that, isn't it?
The role of pimp to a rich person. Yeah.
Yes,
but you get the benefits of whatever luxury life that goes with it.
Yeah. And then anything, well, obviously we've touched on Elon Musk and the actual list coming out. Any other developments we can see in the future, in the near future?
Well, with Ghislaine, it's really a case of will she talk or will she be pardoned? Donald Trump has the option to pardon. Is Ghislaine safe? Well, Nicholas Tartellone, who shared a cell with Jeffrey Epstein at the beginning, and Jeffrey Epstein had marks on his neck. He's suffered attacks in prison himself because he knows too much. People who know too much in these stories can meet a sticky end. It's rather like one of the people who worked for Hillary Clinton that said to me, the Clintons don't necessarily kill people, but it's very strange that a lot of people close to them seem to
She's had a
meet
huge
very
amount of
strange
people,
ends.
friends who've committed suicide.
Yes, how many lawyers have had car accidents?
Exactly.
So in the case of Ghislaine, but Ghislaine has the arrogance. This is the problem of Ghislaine. From having known so many people connected to her, Ghislaine still thinks those people are her friends. She hasn't given anything up because she has the belief that she is still going to come out of prison and everything will be good. It won't be, because forevermore she is the mucky madam. She's the sex trafficking.
Did you coin that term?
Yeah, that was one of the mucky madam Maxwell. Yes, and that's how I would refer to her. So I guess we have nearly concluded this. So what else do we have any questions here? Right, a question. Angelo, we need to have questions. We have questions. You need to organise.
I'm not sure the microphone will pick up from here.
So how likely is Donald Trump to pardon Ghislaine? I think Donald Trump had a good friendship with Ghislaine. He also had a good friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, but he now claims that he got rid of him years ago. But, Donald Trump changes his mind with the wind. He changes his friends with the wind. He at the time of Ghislaine's arrest, said, "I wish Ghislaine well, whatever that may mean." He is very vague about what he wishes to do, but it may suit him to have Ghislaine inside prison rather than outside where she could be a loose cannon. Any
Can I say something very quickly? And we're going back to the Menendez case. Yes. Don't forget, in 1987, the night of the hurricane, the Newell brothers in Jersey had murdered their parents in exactly the same way as the Menendez boys.
Yes.
So the case didn't come up in court in Gibraltar since 1992. And at that point, Roderick Newell was in prison in Gibraltar, and I'm doing it very quickly, and his brother, Mark, who was not in jail, was a financial person and had helped to raise money so that Roderick can have his case. So Roderick had admitted, without actually going to a proper trial, because it was only the extradition to Jersey, and that he had killed his parents. And the strange thing is, they did it the same way. They both were abused. They were both had the similar thing, and Roderick is out.
Yes. I have watched programs about the case, and you obviously have a strong connection
Yes.
with the case via your former husband.
Late husband, yeah.
And yes, and I see the same pattern of story there, but with the Menendez case, the difference is it was televised.
Yes.
It was one of the first televised trials, and they were put by their lawyers in, preppy Ralph Lauren clothes, and they were portrayed as these spoilt brats with a Porsche and a, same with this
Yeah.
one, but that was only in notes, in its court reporting, whereas these ones were seen in court, and they weren't allowed to tell their real story. Whereas I think with those brothers, it was much easier. The British justice system was a little more fair,
Yes.
because there were over 60 people in the Menendez case who came forward to say, we know about the abuse that went on. Aunts, uncles, the cousin. And the cousin's letter, if it had been shown, would have proven that they had told people long, long before they committed that murder. And that is evidence that they were scared for their lives. And they did something they should not have done. They should have been convicted of manslaughter, not murder. In that case in Jersey, I know less about their motivation and whether they had a route of an escape, whether there were guns here as well.
They shot
Yes,
their parents
yes.
with
their own gun. Yes,
Yeah.
so it's a very similar
it's
thing.
similar things. So
Yes.
there's a lot of similarities there. But with all the evidence that has come up for the Menendez boys, the courts have not listened to it.
No, and then now it is time for a review. And I have known Gavin Newsom since he was mayor of San Francisco, and I continually harass him and tell him that these boys should be out. And it has taken until now, these TikTok people have actually been the ones that transformed everything. It's taken a bunch of 14, 15-year-old children who weren't even born when these people were sent to jail in 1996 to get interest in this case. And the work of Robert Rand, and he will be remembered as the hero of this story. Dominic Dunn, who I thought was a brilliant writer, will be remembered for the toxicity and the nastiness that he piled upon these two boys. He sided with the wicked parents because they were respectable in their community. Just because you're respectable when you go out in public, behind what goes on behind closed doors can be utterly monstrous. And my big problem with this Netflix program, which was called which I have a huge problem with, Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story, which was the follow-up to the Jeffrey Dahmer story. It focuses on them being the monsters, not the parents.
Yes.
The parents and all these lies about incest and all sorts of other things. These are lies. Having spoken with the key protagonists in this story, I know what I believe.
And the father was abused as well.
Yes. But he came from a family from Mexico where he had to fight for, to get wealthy in America, and he got wealthy, and he wanted his children to behave the way he wanted them, and he ruled them with a rod of iron, and he was a bully, and he was vicious, and he was terrible, and he was wicked. Next question.
I think we're...
Any more questions?
Do you think the Menendez case would have the same result if it was tried in the UK?
Do I think the Menendez case would have the same result if tried in the UK? It depends on the timing. Back in the 1990s, even here, male victims of abuse people didn't want to talk about males being abused. If it was a female victim, it would have been very different, even here or there. But I think the narrative, if it were tried now here, yes, it would immediately been manslaughter here. It would have been immediately manslaughter there. I think the narrative has changed. So, Claire, have we any
think
concluding remark?
I think we've covered everything. All I was going to say was it does seem in so many of these situations that a lot of the police work is actually seems to be done by very thorough journalists
Well,
who have maybe police are under resourced sometimes. but
well,
you do
any
see it
any
really,
case of true crime I've been associated with, it's taken somebody with tenacity
Exactly,
to
that's the
seize
word,
upon it
that's the
and
word.
and some of these people are obsessive about a particular case. The people I know
can
in the
dedicate
Jeremy
all that
Bamber
time.
case, the people I know who are his supporters, one of them has devoted her thousands of hours to go through millions of pages of documents. And within those documents, you start to find police corruption. Essex Police, to me, is one of the worst police forces. It's one of the worst police forces in Britain. I deal with the Stuart Lubbock case, which, Michael Barrymore is the man who's remembered, not Stuart Lubbock, the victim, who drowned in the entertainer's swimming pool. They messed that up. They never managed. 9 people went to a party. 8 of them lived. Never managed to convict anybody of that poor man's murder. They had the Jeremy Bamber case, which the evidence was mostly burnt in the garden of White House Farm. The issue of the silencer, many issues there. Where, the New Yorker have just done a brilliant series on questions over the Bamber case in a similar way to they investigate other cases like Lucy Letby. I have very different views on Lucy Letby, but there we are. There was a Dr. Jones who murdered his wife and got away with it. That was another one they messed up. The Range Rover murders. These police forces have serial episodes of failing to deal with the actualities of true crime and solving these crimes. I question their enthusiasm for it, whereas there are people who are journalists like Robert Rand who got involved with Menendez. It's taken him half his life to try and get to where he is now. We're still not at resentencing yet, but we are nearly there. So that is something that gives me hope. Now we have these true crime programs and the amateur sleuth in the armchair. We may get justice for a lot of people. The Criminal Cases Review Commission in Britain, it doesn't even deal with 1% of the cases submitted to it. It's an absolutely shocking state of affairs. Absolutely appalling. So, Claire, anything else to say?
Well, I'm conscious that we need to wrap up. I was going to say, out of all these dramatizations, do you have a favourite for just pure entertainment
The only program I recommend you watch of all of the ones is Law and Order True Crime, made in 2017, which is based on lots of Robert Rand's work on the Menendez case.
Okay.
It's a brilliant case. The Law and Order series was the prequel to all of these true crime Netflix things. I think they do great work, and their analysis is actually fair to victims as much as it is to anything else. It's accurate and it's got good research. I think the likes of Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story, that is sensationalist junk, absolute rubbish, and not to be encouraged. So there we go. Thank you very much for listening to us. I'm sorry you couldn't hear us, but we are competing with lots of Christmas parties, and we will see what happens throughout the evening. Thank you very much.